All right, we are getting into the next chapter. Chapter 14 is about evolution. The old book and the PowerPoint, there's some slides that will say chapter 15, but it's not. It's chapter 14. So just stick with me and we'll be in good shape here. All right, so the first section is about just some basic information about Charles Darwin and his theory on natural selection. Natural selection essentially is this idea that organisms that are better suited to survive in their environment, they're more likely to reproduce, eat, find places for resources and water and habitat and things like that. That's what natural selection is all about. And some organisms are better suited for their particular environment than others. So just some basics about Charles Darwin. He went on a trip on the HMS Beagle back in 1831. Darwin is my favorite of all of the scientists that we study. He's my favorite, and the reason he's my favorite wasn't because he was like Einstein. He was like some super brilliant guy that just kind of just would see stuff and just got it and would be thinking all this stuff up. He was just kind of an average Joe. In fact, he went to medical school and flunked out of medical school, moved back home. His dad made him then go to study theology, which is the study of religion. So he was studying theology, and because he had had some medical training, he was invited to be they would call the ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle. It also turns out that the captain was a friend of his. So it worked out pretty well. So he brought his friend with on the trip, and while he was on his 4-year voyage on the Beagle, he did a lot of thinking and he noticed a lot of stuff. And we'll talk about those things here coming up. But at the time that the HMS Beagle set sail, Darwin believed that the Earth was about 6,000 years old. Okay, I mean, obviously we know that that's not true. We know that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old and the universe formed about 14 billion years ago and yada, yada, yada. So a lot of information he's going to gain that's going to sort of change the way he thinks. They also believed at this time that things just remained unchanged. Things didn't change over time. So he joined the ship as the ship's naturalist. It took off from England, made its way down around the southern part of South America to the Galapagos Islands. And that's where he really, when you think about Charles Darwin and the trip that he took on the HMS Beagle, that's what we really mostly think about is his time spent in the Galapagos. But he was making comparisons about things that he saw all around the world. It wasn't just things that he noticed about nature in the Galapagos Islands. We'll talk about why the Galapagos were particularly important in a little bit here. So again, he had a degree in theology, but he went to medical training and had some scientific training as well. So while he's on his trip, he's starting to notice things, and he's collecting a lot of plants, a lot of fossils, live animals, things like that. While he was out at sea, now imagine you're on a ship that is powered by the wind, and if the wind isn't blowing or it stopped blowing, you've got a lot of time on your hands. And he read a book called Principles of Geology. Okay, in this book, it proposed that the Earth was actually millions of years old, not just thousands of years old. And it started to influence his thinking. And while he was on his trip on the Beagle, he started noticing things like he found fossils of organisms that are aquatic organisms. He found those fossils like up in the mountains and things like that. So other things that he noticed was that some of the fossils that he was digging up, there are like larger versions of those fossils. So like mammoths, but like he would find, obviously we have some organisms are relatively small, and then we see these really large, like sloth, right? We have sloths on our planet right now. Well, there used to be like these giant sloths, and they got all these fossils dug up of these giant sloths. So he's wondering what's different. I mean, they're basically the same. It's just a much larger form of the animal. Now, when we think about the Charles Darwin, we oftentimes sort of equate him and his studies and his travels to the Galapagos Islands. And he was in the Galapagos in 1835 when he thought it was going to be like this lush, beautiful paradise, like a tropical paradise. And what he found was that it was actually really quite dry. It was barren. There wasn't it wasn't like tropical rainforest. These islands are made from volcanoes, right? So they're volcanic islands, and it takes a long time to establish soil. Recall learning about primary and secondary succession. So this would be a type of primary succession where you have a new territory or new area that's bare. So it was relatively barren. There wasn't a whole lot there. He visited all 4 of the islands, and what he noticed was that the animals on the different islands were different. Okay, so there were tortoises on all of the islands, but the tortoises were a little bit different. There was differences in the ring structure on their shells, their size, their body shape. All of those things were slightly different, or they had what we call variations. Okay, the top right picture here is Steve Irwin. This is Harriet. That's Charles Darwin's pet tortoise that he took with him when he was on the HMS Beagle. And Harriet, I don't remember how old, but she was really old, like 170 years old or something like that. I mean, some crazy age, and was living in a zoo in Australia. But she died back in like 2007. Okay, so while he's on this voyage, it starts to spark a lot of curiosity. He's starting to wonder, okay, so we have different shell shapes or patterns, on the different shells. And he had done a lot of sketching and collected animals and plants and things like that. And so when he got back to England, he's really starting to think about all of the things that he observed on his trip. And then he started thinking about the work of some other people like John Gould, who was an ornithologist. That's an individual that studies or is an expert on birds. And so he started thinking about classifying the birds that he brought back. Anyways, the birds that he brought resembled the species that you would find on the mainland, but they had small variations. They were slightly different. One of the things in particular was the shape of the beak. And we'll get to that in a little bit here. We'll talk about the specifics about the beak here in a second, but all of these differences led him to believe that the animals from the mainland had somehow made their way out to the island. And now consider this, the Galapagos Islands are like, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, almost maybe 1,000 miles from the mainland, right? So a natural bird isn't going to want to fly over the ocean because there's nothing out there. It would be like flying out into empty space. I suppose some fowl that can float and, sit in the water and things like that, they might have made their way out there, but there wouldn't really be a reason because there's nothing out there for them. Okay, so he's thinking that these animals, when they come from the mainland and they make their way out to the island, that they're changing somehow. And what he came up with was that new species appear very slowly or gradually through really, really small changes. And he talks about changes in the ancestral species that would be like, okay, so we have, finches on the mainland, and then somebody brings a finch out to the island, and those finches, they reproduce, and then they sort of change a little bit. So he's coming up with this idea that those changes happen gradually, or that's his hypothesis, okay? So he started talking to pigeon breeders to get an idea of what was going on. And most of them had fan-shaped tails, but the pigeon breeders were doing something called artificial breeding. Now, we do that all the time, right? You want a Labrador or you want a dog that's good at hunting, then you breed 2 together that are good at hunting, and you end up with a hunting dog, okay? So artificial breeding is deliberately breeding 2 organisms together for some intended trait. Maybe you want a different color dog hair. Maybe you want a dog that has, that reddish color hair. So you find 2 dogs that have close to that, you breed them together, and then hopefully they have that reddish color hair. So we do this all the time. We do it with dogs. We do it agriculturally. We do it with tons and tons of different stuff around the planet. We're able to do this artificial breeding. And what he came to believe was that this happens naturally. And it turns out that he's right. Okay, so organisms compete for the resources that they need, and the ones that are better equipped to survive are the ones that are going to survive. And because they're surviving, they're more likely to reproduce, and their offspring go on to further generations. Okay, so the principles that led to natural selection or lead to natural selection, this is the idea that the organisms that are better equipped are going to have a higher rate of their genes being passed to subsequent generations. Okay, so individuals in a population, they have to show variations. There has to be differences among those organisms, right? Some are tall, some are short, some have blue feathers, some have white feathers, who knows? Those variations have to be able to be inherited, right? So back to genetics, we know that those traits get inherited from one generation to the next. Organisms have to be able to have more offspring than what can survive. That kind of makes sense, right? Because if you have offspring and they die, then there's no sense in that, because they're not going to be able to send any genes into further generations. And then those variations have to have reproductive success. Okay, so that means that those individuals will have a better chance of surviving and those traits being passed on to another generation. You know, we talked about I mentioned earlier, the beaks of the birds. Some islands had more bugs for the birds to eat, for the finches to eat, and so they have the long, slender, pointy beaks. Okay, some of the islands had more nuts and things like that. So those islands had finches that had kind of short, stubbier beaks, because they're stronger and better capable of crushing and breaking up or accessing the nuts and then breaking them into pieces so they can be eaten and digested. And then there's also the intermediates between there, and we'll get to those in a different section. So he comes up with this idea of natural selection, and this is Darwin's theory that over long periods of time, a population of organisms can be modified or changed enough to produce a whole new species. Now recall that a whole new species means that those individuals from that population now can no longer have offspring with one another, okay? They wouldn't have offspring that are able to survive. So basically, here's how natural selection works, right? We've got these birds and there's a whole bunch of ticks here, right? Well, the birds are saying, ooh, yum, the green beetles are really good. That's our favorite. So they tend to eat all the green beetles. Well, if all the green beetles get eaten, what's going to happen? We're going to have more orange beetles and fewer green beetles, right? So several generations later now, they've eaten all of the green beetles, and all that's left are the orange, or what they're calling the brown beetles. And the brown beetles have flourished, right? Now, the adaptation that they have that makes it more advantageous for them is that they're orange, or for whatever reason they taste different, or they're camouflaged, or whatever. Now, obviously, that orange color in nature isn't nearly as camouflaged as like a greenish color. So Charles Darwin, doing all this, research and putting all this information together, he's using information from other people. He also was using some information that he got from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a biogeographer, who was also kind of working on the same idea at the same time. But in 1840, he came up with his theory of natural selection, and he wrote a book that's really, 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 really long. It's like 1,000 pages long. And it compiled all of the different types of evidence and the observations that he made that led him to this theory. Alfred Russel Wallace came up with a theory that was very similar, but Charles Darwin published first, and so he's the one that we give credit. We give him credit first, or the most of the credit for it. So in 1859, he publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in that book, it's interesting to note, because there's a lot of debate about evolution and things like that. But in that book, in the original version of that book, he doesn't even use the word evolve. It wasn't until a revision was done that he actually used the word evolve, or evolution, or derivation of the word evolution. And he only used it one time, and it was in the very last sentence of that book. So evolution then is described by this cumulative changes in groups of organisms over long periods of time. Here's where he used the word evolved, and this is in the very last sentence of his book. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Okay, it means that they have evolved and they're still being evolved. One of the categories, or one of the traits of living things, is that over periods of time, living things evolve, they change, they adapt to their environment. And they do that because there are some things that are advantageous and some things that aren't. And as environments change, those organisms have to change along with it, otherwise they'll end up going extinct. So it's not, his quote is sort of, it's one of my favorite ones. It's not the strongest of the species that survives or the most intelligent, but it's the one most adaptable to change, right? So meaning the organisms that are the most flexible, the ones that can weather the storm, things like that, those are the ones that are most likely to survive and reproduce and have their genes passed on to subsequent generations. Okay, obviously we're not doing a pop quiz. That brings us on to 15.2, and I know I'm going kind of fast here, and I apologize. So, you know, Charles Darwin is doing all this research about evolution, and he came up with some key pieces that sort of, or he didn't, because a lot of this research came afterwards, but these are the different types of evidence that we have that support the theory of evolution. Now, these are all different organisms, like one's a chicken, one's a dog, one's a rabbit, one's a human being, one's a cow. Okay, these are early embryonic stages of all of these different mammals. Or I'm sorry, they're not all mammals because some are birds. They're all vertebrates. Okay, and what we notice is that early on in early embryonic stages, they look very similar. Like these are gill slits or gill pouches. Okay, they're actually, the technical word is called pharyngeal pouches. Okay, well, those are gill slits. If you're a fish, that's great because you're going to need to have gills at some point in time. But if you're a human being, we don't breathe water, so why do we have to have gill slits? Well, that's a really great question, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. Okay, so as these organisms develop, they sort of start to differentiate, or they separate, or they go apart from one another, and they're starting to change. Their physical characteristics and their forms are starting to change. We get to the point at later embryonic stages where we can definitely tell a difference between a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a human, a chicken. There's a rabbit, or I'm sorry, there's the chicken. Here's a pig. You know, so we can see those differences, but at early embryonic stages, they're all very, very similar. So you can see on this one, fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, hog, calf, a rabbit, and a human. Okay, so here are the 5 different pieces of evidence that support evolution. We'll talk about each one of those, but if you want to pause here, write those down, and then leave some space, you know, maybe like a line or two. If you're taking notes, leave a line or two so you can write the stuff down, okay? Okay, so the fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative biochemistry, which is essentially DNA, comparative embryology, and then geographic distribution, or what we call biogeography. That's what Alfred Russel Wallace was studying. Okay, so evidence that supports evolution. Okay, the origin of species demonstrates or shows how evolution may have happened. Okay, but we didn't really know the mechanisms for how it happened. And a lot of people thought Charles Darwin was pretty crazy initially. But his ideas started to provide evidence that evolution has occurred. So then the theory of evolution was developed. And what it says is that all organisms on Earth have evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, you know, when we talk about, we won't get to it this year, but when we talk about primate evolution, and humans are primates, we talk about that tree of life and how all organisms are related, right? We share almost entirely all of our DNA with all other organisms on Earth. Okay, so the first type of evidence is from the fossil record. The fossil record provides some of the most significant evidence of evolution. So what we do, we have ancient species, and we compare similarities with modern species, and we look at some of the structures and the functions of those organisms to see if they're the same. On the bottom left here, we have a armadillo, right? That's a giant armadillo, but we know that we have armadillos now, so we compare modern day armadillos to these ancient ones, and they're basically the same, they're just smaller in size. And we can use this to sort of determine the ancestry between different organisms. You know, some organisms are very, very old, like, and haven't changed for millions and millions of years. Crocodiles is a great example. Horseshoe crabs, which was a picture down here, they've remained unchanged for millions of years. We can look at fossils of million-year-old horseshoe crabs, and essentially, you know, according to their form, they are the same. behaviors might have changed. Archaeopteryx is a fossil. I think we've talked about Archaeopteryx before, but it has both bird and dinosaur traits. It has feathers like a modern bird, but it also has like teeth and tail and claws and stuff like reptiles. It's classified as a bird, but it has a lot of distinct dinosaur features, right? This is just an artist's rendition. I think that's what it probably would have looked like, but here's the fossil over here on the right. So those are what we call transitional fossils, and we're looking at derived versus ancestral traits. Okay, the derived traits are the newly evolving traits. They don't appear in the fossils, but we might see those in more or newer organisms that we find, or fossils that we find of those organisms. And then there's ancestral traits. Those are the primitive features, okay? Sorry, I'm going kind of fast here, but you know, so feathers would be an ancestral trait for birds, right? Because birds have had feathers for as long as we've known about birds. But some of the ancestral trait, or the primitive features, would be like teeth, tails, things like that. If we're talking about dinosaurs that evolved, you know, feathers, the development of feathers would be the derived trait, because previous to Archaeopteryx, dinosaurs didn't have any feathers that we knew of. There's also comparative anatomy, and there's two different parts here. So we're basically comparing the anatomy amongst different organisms. There's homologous structures. Those are ones that are anatomically, and that means like where on the body they are, that are anatomically similar, inherited from a common ancestor, like the forelimbs of mammals, right? Like horses and humans are very different organisms, but we both have forelimbs, right? And we have two on the upper part of our body and two on the lower part of our body, right? Arms and legs. Well, you can think about horses, you know, having arms and legs, but we just call them legs, okay? So like the forelimbs of animals, those would be considered homologous structures because they are anatomically found in roughly the same place. Vestigial structures is something that's kind of interesting to talk about, because those are structures that have a reduced form or function like a human appendix. Now, probably you guys know somebody that has had their appendix taken out, or an appendix that's ruptured. The appendix for a human being does absolutely nothing, okay? It had to have done something in the past, because otherwise our body wouldn't have it, right? No organism is going to develop something just for the sake of developing something. It has to have had some function at some point in that organism's history. So we're going back, you know, millions, hundreds of millions, you know, whatever. Another vestigial structure would be a pelvis of a whale. Now, the function of a pelvis is to hold the weight of the upper body. Well, whales are in the water, and their body weight is distributed amongst all of the surfaces because they're swimming around in the water. So they have zero need for a pelvis. Humans have a huge need for a pelvis because we need something that supports all of the weight from the upper part of our bodies, okay? Whale pelvis is really, really, really small, which kind of makes sense because they don't need it, right? But they must have evolved from a common ancestor that at one point needed it. So if those structures aren't needed, they tend to become smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, they may be lost if they're not used. Analogous structures is a little bit different. This is what organisms use for the same function, right? So like, you know, birds would use a wing for flying. Well, bats are mammals, and they use wings for flying, and insects have wings and they use their wings for flying, right? So now we're not necessarily talking about where physically those things are located on the organism, but rather the function that performs, okay? Embryology, we talked about a little bit. The pre-birth stages, what we call embryonic stages. We study the embryonic stages to determine that there's a close relationship between those organisms. This is comparative embryology, and that's when we use DNA. I'm sorry, that shouldn't say embryology. That, I don't know why that thing came down. Anyway, so DNA gets used to determine which organisms are the most genetically similar. Like humans and chimpanzees have very, very similar DNA, okay? The next one is geographic distribution. So biogeography. Biology is studying living things. Geography means different areas of the earth, different structures on the earth. So biogeography is studying the distribution of the organisms around the planet. So what we're looking at here is organisms that look the same, like an armadillo versus an anteater, a giant anteater versus the pangolin versus the spiny anteater. They're all very similar in structure and form, but they live very far from each other, meaning that they did. They each evolved differently because of differences in those environments where they live. So again, fossil record, you've probably already written these down. If not, you don't have, fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative biochemistry, comparative embryology, and geographic distribution. That slide with Jane Goodall and the chimpanzee, that should have said comparative biochemistry. So adaptations are essentially what make Darwin's theory work, okay? And adaptation is a trait that gets shaped by natural selection. So it helps the organism to have reproductive success, okay? Or what we call fitness, right? When we think about fitness, it's like, oh, I can run a mile in 6 minutes. And okay, you have good fitness. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about the measure of how much a trait gets passed on to the next generation. So essentially, a trait that makes an organism much better suited to survive, and then pass those traits on to the next generation, like camouflage or something like that. So the better the organism is adapted for its environment, the greater its odds are of surviving when there are changes in that environment, okay? Some organisms are camouflaged, and that's a really pretty basic one we've talked about for years and years and years, okay? But there's another one called mimicry, okay? It's not like camouflage because these organisms aren't necessarily trying to hide, but they're trying to resemble other organisms. Like this is a snake, right? I don't remember the name of this. I kind of feel like I want to say it's a puff adder, but I'm not positive. Okay, so the puff adder is a dangerous venomous snake. Organisms tend to stay away from it, right? Because it's dangerous. Well, these insects or these bugs, if you will, have evolved themselves to resemble or to look or to mimic the puff adder or that snake because other organisms will leave it alone. Okay, so it kind of makes sense. It's like putting itself in disguise. These are coral snakes, and the coral snakes are different colors. Some species of coral snake, or not species because they're all the same species. Some live in an environment where they're living on the rocks. Some are living right near the water by the rocks. Some are living inland more, right? So they've evolved differently. Eventually it will get to the point that they've evolved so much or they've adapted so much that they can no longer reproduce, and that's what we call speciation. Okay, not all adaptations are good. Some adaptations have consequences, and sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not. But evolving from other primates, humans developed the ability to walk upright, okay? Now, the human head is really big, okay? And in order for human babies, they're pretty helpless, right? If you have a baby, you can't just leave it out in the wild and expect it to survive. Humans adapted the ability to walk upright, but as they adapted, they had to be born earlier because if they became too large, their head, an infant's head, would not fit through the pelvis of the female during birth. Okay, other primates, gibbons, gorillas, chimpanzees, that's not an issue. Okay, so when we think about babies, the adaptation for being able to walk upright was a very good adaptation for human beings, but it came with some consequences. Babies had to be born earlier in development, and therefore making them more helpless than they would be. Say if you were a baby chimpanzee can come out of the womb and not live on its own, but it is much more self-sufficient. Whereas a human baby, essentially, if you don't do anything for that baby, it's going to die within a few days. Okay, there are 7 ways. Oh, okay, so 15.3, and I got a class coming in here in a minute, or coming up in a minute here. So it's 14.3, I apologize, is how evolutionary theory is shaped, like what how it happens. So the first part is the Hardy-Weinberg principle that says if allele frequency is the same in a population, it'll be in genetic equilibrium and evolution doesn't occur. We have to have new genes introduced in order for evolution to occur. Genetic drift is this idea that a change in the frequency, that's how many alleles there are for a particular trait in a population, and it's due to chance, okay? When we think about genetic drift, we talk about random samples, and it'd be like if you reached into the jar and you picked out a marble in the original population, yeah, you might have even numbers of, or equal numbers of those 3 marbles, but in the second generation, they're maybe not equal because the allele frequency is changing, because one trait might be better than another. And then as you go on from generation to generation, sometimes those alleles that are coding for different traits, they just disappear altogether, right? Like, let's just say it was for blonde hair, right? If somehow human beings just were selecting for individuals with dark colored hair, eventually the light colored hairs, people with hair, you wouldn't see that allele in the population very much anymore. The founder effect is an interesting one. That happens when we take a small sample of a population, so a small number of individuals from a population, and they go to a different area. We find this happening with the Amish community. They have a higher occurrence of polydactyly, meaning that instead of having 5 fingers, they have 6. So we see the picture down here. So if we were to take a survey of the population of humans in America, a very small amount of those individuals are going to have 6 fingers. But if you go to an Amish colony, you'll probably find that there's a significantly higher number of individuals that have 6 fingers. So bottleneck is happening when a population declines population declines due to low numbers, and then that rebounds. So these are elephant seals, and the example I like to talk about with this is elephant seals live on the coastline of California, and fishermen didn't like the elephant seals being around because they ate the fish. So the fishermen killed almost all of the elephant seals. The ones that remained, most of them had this disease where it causes their skin to kind of molt and shed off, okay? Well, then there was regulations that said, hey, you can't be killing these elephant seals anymore, so the population rebounds, okay? But the problem is that the original members now of that population, most of them have this skin molting disease, so the offspring also are going to be sharing those genes with their ancestors, and they also are going to have those problems because the genes are limited. They were limited to a small number. Gene flow is pretty straightforward. That's random movement of individuals between populations. It's like if there was a herd of deer on one side of the mountain versus the other side of the mountain, the environment's different. They'll evolve differently on one side of the mountain than the other. Well, all of a sudden you have a couple of deer that are like, forget this, we're going over the mountain, we're going to go join that other group. Okay, so they take their genes to another population, and then they introduce their genes into that population, and that can create more genetic variation amongst that population. Non-random mating is a tendency to mate with individuals in close proximity, right? So like wolf packs, you see a lot of this in wolf packs. It leads to inbreeding. So like oftentimes wolves, it'll be like brothers and sisters having offspring, cousins having offspring. They don't, socially that's acceptable in a wolf pack. Obviously for humans, not so much. Natural selection then is this idea that individuals that are best adapted for their environment are the ones that are going to be able to survive and reproduce more successfully, okay? This acts on the organism's genotype, okay? So, or I'm sorry, not the genotype, the phenotype. Obviously, the genotype causes the phenotype. The phenotype is the physical trait, okay, that you actually see or can test for. So if that phenotype, the physical thing, makes that individual more likely to survive and reproduce, obviously then those genes are going on to subsequent generations. Okay, so this is affecting the allele frequency. So there's three ways that natural selection will alter the phenotype or the physical traits of those organisms. Okay, the first one is stabilizing selection. Okay, so we have extreme expressions of a trait are eliminated if the average or the mix between the two, if you will, leads to higher fitness or more reproductive success. So the finches, right? We have the short stubby beaks versus the long slender beaks. Realistically, if you're in the middle somewhere, then you should be able to eat most nuts, and you can also get at most of the insects, right? So that makes those individuals with the intermediate beak a little more successful. Directional selection happens when we have extreme versions of a trait, make the organism more fit. In the late 1800s, there was moths that would live on the trees in Europe. And with the advent, and the trees were white and the moths were white. Okay, so we're probably talking about birch trees. Well, with the Industrial Revolution, all of the trees started to get this soot on them, so they started turning dark in color. Well, as they're turning dark in color, the moths are more visible to predators, and they started getting eaten. Well, that's going to leave behind the dark colored moths, and now all of a sudden, if you're a dark colored moth, life is good. You have better success, better reproductive success, more likely to survive. Disruptive selection is happening when we remove individuals with the average traits for the more extreme traits. Okay, so these are snakes, again, we talked about the coral snakes earlier, but some snakes that live right along the water's edge or in the water, they're going to blend in with that environment better. And then we have some that live, they're the same species, but they live more inland in the trees. And so they're extreme forms, right? You're either going to be the tan color or you're going to be the darker color. There's no intermediate form like there would have been before. Sexual selection is a trait that makes an individual more attractive to the opposite sex, but it does not enhance survival. Oftentimes you'll see that the male of a species, and this is true for many, many, many different species, birds especially, is that the males tend to be more colorful, but being more colorful makes them more likely to be identified by predators. The females tend to be more bland, kind of camouflaged colors. So this is two birds of paradise. One is a male, one is a female. This is actually the tail feathers. If you guys remember, I'm sure you've recall seeing that when we've watched Planet Earth before. They dance around and click their heels and things like that. It's kind of fun. So speciation happens when you have these populations that are going so different from another, how they're adapting to their environments, that all of a sudden it creates a whole new species. They can no longer have offspring with one another, and they become a new species. So there's some different types of speciation. Allopatric speciation happens when there's barriers that divide a population into different categories, right? So like chipmunks or squirrels, one lives on one side of the Grand Canyon, the other one lives on the other side of the Grand Canyon. They're obviously not very far apart, but they can't go from one side to the other because there's obviously a huge barrier there. Other types of things that would cause allopatric speciation would be like mountain ranges, a new lava flow that separated two areas, or big canyons, things like that. Sympatric speciation happens when those species evolve without physical barriers. Sunfish are a great example. There are tons of different types of sunnies, and they all kind of live together and they're hanging out, but they're different. Physically and genetically, they are different, and they cannot reproduce with one another. Adaptive radiation happens when that's a type of speciation where you have a bunch of species that are separating each other from a common ancestor. If there's some sort of a new ecological opportunity, that could be like a new type of food, or a change in the environment, or things like that create some sort of an opportunity, and then some of those organisms are going to take advantage of that opportunity, and because of that, they're going to adapt a little bit differently. So gradualism is this idea that evolution happens really, really slowly. And in most cases, that's how it happens, in very slow, gradual steps. Okay, that's gradualism. However, sometimes it can happen relatively quickly, especially when we have extreme changes that happen over a very short period of time, like a volcanic eruption, or maybe a drought that lasts for a couple hundred years and water dries up, or, you know, whatever it happens to be. Now, obviously, we're talking about geologic time. That's billions of years, you know, 4.6 billion years the Earth is. But if we talk about like 1,000 years, that's relatively quick. And if even hundreds of years, that's very quick, right? So we have these rapid changes that cause adaptations that eventually lead to natural selection, which leads to speciation. So we have a new species. Okay, that's it for the chapter. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I hope this video finds you all doing well. And I'm looking forward to being back in the classroom with you guys in the fall. Take care.